The History of Curb Your Enthusiasm, Season 1, Episode 8, Beloved Aunt. My thoughts on the thoughts of Jeff Garlin and Susie Essman, coming up right after this. Hey everyone, I'm Yoel and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So grateful to have you. And in today's video, we're going to continue with our discussion on the fantastic new series, not so new anymore, called The History of Curb Your Enthusiasm, starring Jeffrey Garlin and Susie Essman. And today's video is on Season 1, Episode 8, called Beloved Aunt. Okay, so as I've mentioned in the previous videos, that I've gone through and watched the episode so that I'm more refreshed. So a lot of my thoughts will be on the episode itself to give you a fan's perspective, but also some thoughts on the thoughts or on the insights of Jeff and Susie as well. So I thought that gives you a little bit more of a well-rounded perspective. As always, your comments and feedback are welcome. I'll be looking down at my trusty notes, so forgive me if I look away from the camera. I do my best to edit, but I try not to spend too much time on video editing, as you can obviously see from these videos. Okay, so without further ado, first of all, I agree with Jeff and Susie, by the way, that this show starts coming into its own with this episode. It's just so funny and perfect. And I was thinking that I was watching the show, that this really was already at a different level, this episode of the previous. Obviously, they were all great to begin with, but this one really started launching Curb into a different stratosphere. So I agree with Jeff and Susie when they were talking about that. And again, Susie, for those who don't know, Susie calls the funeral, the show starts off at a funeral, and Susie says it's a total goyish funeral. So for those who don't speak the vernacular, what she means by that is the goyish meaning non-Jewish funeral. I love it when Susie uses these terms, and only if you understand Yiddish or Yiddishisms, if you will you get what she's saying. And if you don't, I'm grateful that I can fill that in on this channel. So that's what she means. If you were watching and you heard her say goyish funeral, that's what Susie means. She means a non-Jewish style funeral. And I love the fact that everybody's all somber and everything like that, long faces. And then you've got Larry just checking the thermostat, which is vintage Larry. He's concerned with how hot he is, and he wants, or probably not cold, how hot he is, and he wants to make sure that he's feeling comfortable. He's probably sweating in that suit, schwitzing, probably, as Susie would say, which means sweating. And there's Larry checking the thermostat. I just thought that was such a classic Larry David to be doing at a somber funeral. And somebody says to Larry, he wishes him his condolences. Of course, he can't just say thanks. He says, well, it was Cheryl's sister, it wasn't my sister. He has to make that distinction. I think the average person would probably just say thanks, appreciate that. But with Larry, well, it wasn't my sister, Cheryl's. Classic Larry as well. And Jeff and Susie talk about this as well. So one of the earlier scenes is the sister of the sister who passed away. I forgot her name already on the show, and I definitely forgot the name of the actress who plays her. But she's dating somebody, and this guy goes up to Larry and starts asking for relationship advice, which is just classic to be asking Larry David for relationship advice. And he wants to know if he can break up, because he was about to break up when the news of the passing of his girlfriend's sister happened, and now he doesn't know what to do. And this happened, by the way, this is something that, of course, it must have happened to somebody Larry knows, and he took note of it. As Jeff always says, that Larry likes to make notes of funny things that happen to him in day-to-day life. And I know this was happening with somebody who I knew. He wanted to get divorced for a long time, but then his wife ended up getting sick. And he used to say to good friends that now he can't do it, like he'll just look like a total asshole, even though the marriage had been on the rocks for a long time. And to his credit, he didn't. Today they are divorced, so it did end up happening. I'm grateful. I'm happy to say that his now ex-wife ended up recovering. Hopefully she's in remission. So, they ended up getting divorced. But it was interesting that when I was watching this episode, it reminded me of the fact that this actually happened to me, where I knew somebody who couldn't get divorced, couldn't have a breakup because of the timing of it. So as usual, it's art imitating life, as one would say for Curb Your Enthusiasm. And it's great also when Larry's asked about when he got married to Cheryl. He said after we had intercourse, we got engaged and married, which is, again, another classic Larry David line. Like, who says that after we had intercourse? I think Susie talked about that in the podcast as well. Oh, and also I mentioned how Larry's just the worst person to ask for relationship advice. Susie said the same thing, I noticed in the podcast. And it's funny, they're talking about the idea that there's no rugelach, Susie says. It's another Jewishism of what they serve at funerals. They have all sorts of food that at Jewish funerals, or shivas as we call them, where it's 7 days of mourning, a mourning period after somebody passes away. Although in the episode, by the way, this is an interesting note, in the episode, the woman committed suicide, I believe. In Jewish law, technically, there's a lot of loopholes and exceptions these days, but generally speaking, in Jewish law, when somebody commits suicide, the family members do not sit Shiva. Okay, they do not have that mourning period afterwards. Again, nowadays it's very different. There's all sorts of loopholes, maybe is not the right word, but there's all sorts of extraneous circumstances where a lot of times the family members do. But generally speaking, the basic baseline rule, if you will, of Jewish law is that if somebody commits suicide, the family members do not sit the traditional 7-day mourning period for the passing of a relative. So, and it's only certain types of relatives that sit Shiva that end up sitting for those 7 days of grieving, but that's a whole other discussion. But I just thought I would point that out as an interesting fact. I won't call it a fun fact because we're talking about a serious topic of suicide, but an interesting tidbit to those who may not have known that. Oh, and I was getting back to the Rugelach, and it was funny, by the way, because as I was preparing for this episode, I actually had taken Rugelach. I had gotten Rugelach that I was going to go bring to a friend of mine who was hosting me. So it was just funny. I was watching this episode and Susie's talking about Rugelach, and there I was taking the Rugelach to a friend of mine who was going to host me. So again, we've got life imitating art in this case, or art imitating life. And as usual, Susie always says no deed goes unpunished. So Larry ends up giving advice to this boyfriend, Becky, that's her name. I wrote it down in my notes. Larry ends up giving advice to the boyfriend. He tells him to keep it under wraps and keep it between us. But of course, as Susie says, no good deed goes unpunished in Curb Your Enthusiasm. And sure enough, Larry gets thrown completely under the bus. The boyfriend ends up, or ex-boyfriend ends up telling Becky where he got the advice to break up with her from. And of course, he points the finger at Larry David, even though Larry is very hospitably hosting him, putting him up at the hotel, et cetera, et cetera. And Larry had told him to wait, but of course he didn't do that either. So he didn't take Larry's advice at all. He told Becky that he got the advice from Larry and completely threw him under the bus when he had agreed not to tell anybody, which is another lesson about not being too trusting of people. You got to be very careful who you let into the garden. Only trust those who have proven themselves to be trustworthy, not random brothers-in-law that you don't know very well, such as in the case here of Curb Your Enthusiasm with Larry David. And something I noticed as well, Jeff in the previous episode talked about how he always says, hey, like that, and Larry David asked him to not do it. In this episode, I noticed there was a time where Jeff goes, hey. So I don't know if this was before Larry had asked him to stop doing it, or Jeff just did it anyways, but I thought I would point that out because it's some interesting continuity between last week's episode where Jeff talks about Larry asking him not to say hey, but here he does it in this episode. So I'm wondering about when it is exactly that Larry had asked Jeff not to say the hey. And of course, Larry gets into trouble for feeling up, so to speak, Jeff's mom on the show. And Jeff, and they talk about this in the episode, in the podcast as well. Jeff and Susie were saying how the line is just hilarious, where Jeff says to Larry, you caught the feel of my mom. You've got to get out of here, which is just gold. I mean, just imagine someone saying that, you caught the feel over my mother. And Jeff, I'm glad because I wrote it in my notes, and Jeff does end up talking about that on the podcast, about just how funny of a line that is. And of course, I noticed as well when Larry's going to make it up to Jeff's mom and get her, oh no, I think this was before, where Larry's getting a birthday gift for his mom because of the previous time where Larry got into trouble with her, and he gets her these sunglasses, but he doesn't even know how to buy a gift. And Susie's saying how clueless Larry is. He can't even figure out how to buy a gift. I think Susie was a bit hard on Larry. I think Larry didn't know where to get the sunglasses from. He didn't know how to go and gift wrap the gift. Of course, he made it to a whole production. I think the average person would have just said, do you do gift wrapping? No, where can I get it gift wrapped? And that's it. And Larry's like, where do I get a gift wrap? What do I do about scissors? What do I do about tape? Which is completely laying it on thick, but it wouldn't be Larry and Curb Your Enthusiasm if he didn't lay it on thick. And I also noticed the whole scene when they're in the bathroom, they're all together over there, and Jeff wants to kick Larry out. I noticed that Susie actually was defending Larry over here. Okay, so, and Susie and Jeff talked about this in the podcast, where earlier on their relationship, they always have a good relationship throughout all the seasons and the episodes, but Susie is really going out of her way to defend Larry here, which I thought was sweet. It was interesting to see in these earlier episodes just how much Susie was defending Larry. I don't know if she would defend him in the same way in a scenario like this in later episodes and later seasons, but certainly here earlier on, Susie is definitely defending Larry at the onslaught of her mother-in-law. And interesting tidbit, I didn't realize the salesperson, when Larry was going to buy the sunglasses, was played by Larry's niece, as Susie and Jeff pointed out, and she really did do a fantastic job. And interesting fun fact that it was Larry's niece. And I noticed as well, and Susie picked up on this too, that Larry could have used his celebrity to get himself a hotel room, or at least could have tried, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. All he said was he heard of Seinfeld, and he didn't continue by saying, this is to the lady at the front desk of the hotel, you know, I'm the co-creator. He couldn't bring himself to do it. He hates using his celebrity for that. And he's probably like that in real life as well. So I had picked up on that in the show, and Susie points that out in the episode too. And then, of course, Larry bumps into this ex-boyfriend of Becky's, who's just a complete asshole. I mean, this is a guy, can you imagine? Larry's putting him up. Larry told him he could use the mini bar. I forgot to talk about that earlier. He could use the mini bar, take whatever you want. And he goes and gets relationship advice from Larry, breaks up with Becky despite Larry's advice to wait, et cetera, yada, 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 to use the Seinfeld term. And then he goes and throws Larry under the bus when Larry's trying to get himself a hotel room, and Larry's trying to tell the security guard that he paid for the room. Another no good deed goes unpunished. But when you think about it, Larry is the good guy. As I talk about in a lot of my videos on Curb, Larry is the good guy. In this case, Larry really was the good guy, and the brother-in-law was a complete asshole. And of course, we have the ending, the irony of Curb Your Enthusiasm. This co-creator of Seinfeld, he can't even bring himself to say it to get a hotel room. So what happens? He ends up sleeping in his car, and he has to use the sunglasses that he had bought for Jeff's mom to rest his eyes, to protect his eyes from the sun. How ironic. The co-creator, imagine the co-creator of Seinfeld, who's thrown out of his friend, he's thrown out of his house. Cheryl had thrown him out of his house. I forgot to mention. He's thrown out of his friend's house for copying a feel of his Jeff's mother-in-law. And the co-creator of Seinfeld is sleeping in his car. A ludicrous scenario, which would never happen in real life, but it would happen to Larry David and Curb, and it does. And that's why it's a wonderful ending to this episode. And I didn't even mention, by the way, why this is called Beloved Aunt. I'm sure all of you guys know this already. If you're watching this video, you're clearly a Curb fan. But the whole comical how Beloved Aunt ends up getting mistaken for a different word, beloved cunt. It was the slip of one letter, and that's how Larry got himself into trouble and getting himself thrown out of his house to begin with. And really you have all these different scenes and storylines coming together to form a perfect plot that all meshes at the end, as Jeff talks about. I forgot the name of that person, that producer, director, who Larry this is kind of modeled after, where he's able to bring all these scenes together to one cohesive ending. But it's just a wonderful thing. In this episode, it was done so beautifully, with Larry being kicked out of his house, kicked out of Jeff's house, and then eventually sleeping in the car and shading himself from the sun with the sunglasses he had bought for Jeff's mother-in-law, who he had been accused of copying a feel over. So that's the ending of the show. Just perfect. The co-creator of Seinfeld sleeping in his car. And this is the ending of my video. I hope you found that to be entertaining, educational, informative. That's a bit of a strong term for a video like this, meant to be in good fun, not to take it too seriously. But I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments about things that you picked up on that I didn't catch, or maybe Jeff and Susie didn't talk about either, or maybe we did talk about it, but you wanted to add your 2 cents, feel free to leave that in the comments below. Your feedback is always welcome and appreciated. If you've subscribed to the channel already, I'm really grateful. If you haven't yet, I would be grateful if you did. It definitely helps me, but it helps you as well to not miss a future video. I've got videos on all sorts of different topics, whether more lighthearted like this or more serious types of things like consciousness and Michael Singer and all that. You can see in my video library. And if you've hit that like button in the past, please be so kind as to do it on this video as well. And as always, I'm so grateful that you came to my channel, that you watched this video. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you at the next video. Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed that video. I've got plenty more in my videos library. If there's a topic you'd like me to discuss, feel free to leave that in the comments and I'll do my best to address it. If you can like the video, I'd be very grateful. As well, if you subscribed, you'd be helping me out. You'd also be helping yourself out to not miss a future video. Thanks so much. Have a great day.